All right, you guys, so we have some back bends to talk about now and to break down, knowing that having watched the introduction, the maximum back bend you can easily attain in cobra pose, pressing up from the floor into high cobra. When you reach compression, you are reaching your maximum back bend, at least in your lower spine there, and the general shape of your spine is going to be what we're working with in all of these back bends. So that's something to keep in mind. The first back bend we're going to talk about is Ekapada Raja Kapotasana, which is king pigeon pose. The base of this pose is pigeon. So before workshopping it as a back bend, you need to have explored pigeon pose, one-legged pigeon, beforehand. You need to know how much external rotation you're working with in your hips and how much extension you're working with in your back leg, because in king pigeon, we take the hands away from the floor in many of the binds, and so you won't have your hands down to support you or to take out some of the weight. So we need to understand the ranges of motion that we're working with in our legs. So if you have any feeling that you need blocks or props, then you really need to have those with you before you workshop pigeon as a back bend. So if this is as much as I can do in terms of external rotation and flexion of my hip, then I'm going to make sure that if I'm going to come up and do this as a back bend, that I support myself, that I support my hip with a block or with a rolled blanket back here. So this is going to be the first pose you're going to have to workshop. The first preparatory pose is going to be pigeon. And of course, you can practice Ekapada Kapotasana, which is this one-legged pigeon, down lower, right, to stretch more of the external rotators and abductors on the front leg. When you start to play with this as a back bend, you come up higher, right? So I could have my hands on additional blocks here to help kind of lift me out of my hips. But you're going to be coming up higher, and then just like in splits, the higher I come up, the more I'm stretching the hip flexors, the psoas on the leg that's extending, the one that's going behind me. It's not that I don't feel anything in this leg or this hip, but I definitely feel more in my back leg coming up than I do when I'm down here, right? Because this hip is going to be more in neutral, the back one, the more I come down. Okay. So Ekapada Raja Kapotasana is going to start somewhere from here, one-legged pigeon pose. In king pigeon, the back leg bends, and then there's some kind of connection made with that back foot with one arm or both arms, right? So it could look like this, it could look like this, it could look like this, you could have a strap. There's so many different ways we can connect with that back foot or the back leg. But just thinking, first of all, when you bend your back leg like that, what has to happen? Like, what has to be flexible? Your quadriceps and your hip flexors for sure. So before you workshop king pigeon, and really any of these back bends, we need to stretch our quads. We need to stretch the quadriceps, we need to stretch the psoas, and great places to do that are lunges, especially being up higher like this. If you're in lunge and you're down low like a lizard pose, you can even try it. When you're down lower, at least for me, I feel more stretch response inside the front leg than I do the hip flexors here. I've got to come up higher like this, and I can better stretch because of the relationship from this leg to my torso. I can better stretch in front right here. So versions of lunge are great ways and places to stretch your hip flexors anyway. Sinking low, this kind of a lunge will stretch more of your, like the anterior capsule of your hip, the joint capsule. If you're in lunge like this and you actually tuck under and come up a little bit higher, so not sinking as low, coming up, tucking under, you can really isolate more of the whole iliopsoas here from your spine down to the leg. So both versions of lunge, this version with anything going on with your arms that you want, and then maybe more of this version, right, where the hips go lower, are great places and ways to stretch your hip flexors. Your psoas is your main hip flexor, but your quadriceps, particularly the rectus femoris, is a hip flexor too. And when you go into back bends, the quadriceps receive a big stretch. So finding ways and places to put both the iliopsoas and your quadriceps on a stretch are great. You could come back into a lunge shape, because we know this is stretching the psoas and the hip flexors on not this side, but the other side. I could be here, even down lower, and with the top of the foot down, bend and extend. Trying to get above my kneecap there so it's more comfortable. But I could practice putting both muscle groups on a stretch, right? Pulling my heel up towards my bum, I can really feel a stretch near the top of my hip, the top of my quads, and release, without needing to bind or connect with my foot. And there are other places you could do this too. You could be in a cobra position. So if you're sequencing a class and you're gonna do back bends, these are places you might think about incorporating some knee bends. So you could be in a cobra, any kind of cobra really, or even a sphinx, and practice bending your legs. Bending the legs as you come up, right? So you could bend and extend. Exhale, inhaling, exhaling, inhaling, exhaling, right? Of course, you can just stretch your quadriceps more by themselves. Like there's that stretch that runners sometimes do when they take breaks or before they run, where they simply stand and pull one of their legs up to stretch the quadriceps. You won't be able to see everything, but you know this one, right? Where you're reaching back, stretching right here, and your hips are more in neutral, so it's more of a true like quadriceps stretch. And sure, you could do this too. Why not? Just different ideas to stretch these main muscle groups. Of course, when we talk about the upper body and what you're able to do with your arms, then we need to talk about and find ways to stretch the upper part of the body, to stretch the abdominals, to stretch the pecs, to stretch the lats. Cobras, downward facing dog, puppy pose, side bends, those are all really great places to really stretch the front line of the body and the lats, which if the lats are really strong or tight, they can limit how much you can reach your arms up. So side warrior, side angle, things like that are great ways to help you free up the movements that you're gonna need for back bends. So once we stretched the front line, quads, psoas, abdominals, pecs, and then some of the side line too, lats, we're ready to start exploring things like king pigeon. Now the binds and the arms obviously involve shoulder blade movement, as I was explaining in the introduction. Not only does your shoulder blade movement affect what you can do with binding, but your proportions affect that also. You might want to have a strap handy for any kind of bind you're going to try to do overhead or even reaching back. If you've got a smaller back bend, if you reach compression soon in your spine and you can't bend back as far, you can't reach back as far, right? So you might have a strap for that reason. You might have longer legs. It can just be helpful as a tool. So let's say we're ready to start workshopping the kramas of king pigeon pose. Probably a good idea to start in pigeon and to be there for a little bit so you can really feel out exactly where you need to be in your hips, exactly the angle of your legs. Obviously, the next thing that would need to happen is this leg starts to bend. And you can see I can do that without holding on to it. I can just explore bending and extending. And I can actively pull my leg up back there into that active stretch. And this might be like krama 2, right? This might be a second stage because this is coming up. This is stretching more of my hip flexors like a back bend does. This is stretching those same hip flexors even more on the same side by bending the leg, pulling on the quadriceps. And I could keep my hands down. Like if my arms were longer, I could keep them on the floor. I could have even 2 more blocks and press my heart up and actually extend back into a back bend. Like I could just back bend like this, leaning back without the bind, right? If we wanted to get the upper body more involved, to stretch more in the front and to open up physically and energetically more in the heart space, then we bind. We could reach back, we could reach overhead, do various things with the arms. So why don't we talk about reaching back first, just keeping it more simple. I'm gonna come onto the other side. And using the block, for me, it helps me not turn my hips so much, which will make doing all of this stuff in the back easier and more friendly on my lower back, so I can stay more parallel to the front. From here, if I wanted to play with the idea of binding, I could simply take the hand on the same side as the foot and extend it, reach it backwards. This is extension of your shoulder. So I could reach back. If you grab your foot or not, it depends on how much quadricep flexibility you have. It depends on the length of your legs and your arm. But you might be able to, without a strap, reach back and grab your ankle on that same side, right? And then once you've made that connection, you could gently pull your leg back and it will pull your arm back with it. So that you don't get pulled into like this twisting thing, you could reach back with the other arm as well, extend that arm, and maybe they both try to make a connection back there. I'm actually pushing my legs like down into the floor. Do you see that? So I'm not just like sinking in my joints. I'm actively lifting up here, reaching back. I could bind around my leg and pull my leg back like that, right? Which helps to open what? My upper body or my lower body more? My upper body. It really helps to stretch my inner shoulder, my chest. This is one option. You could reach back and bind with your arms like that. You could have a strap handy, and you might have wanted to set it up beforehand. Like if you know that you couldn't reach for whatever reason, you could try to lasso your foot, right? Or you could try to set it up beforehand. You could have made a loop in your strap before you got into pigeon, period. So you might have done that in tabletop and then come down into pigeon. And then when you were ready to start workshopping, the binds or reaching back, the strap could be right there. You can also incorporate rotation and like a mermaid bind into this. So when you're in this stage, this version of King Pigeon, you might decide instead of just extending your shoulder and reaching back, you could rotate your spine. You'd have to rotate a little bit towards this back foot, reach back for it. This is still shoulder extension. But in the mermaid bind, instead of like maybe using the leg to pull your heart open more, you could actually pull the leg in closer to you, bending it more, and try to get that foot into the crook of your arm. So it's different, right? Instead of being completely parallel and reaching back like this, maybe holding on the outside, I would rotate a little bit in my back. And instead of reaching on the outside, I might reach on the inside, okay? You see that? And then I could bend my leg or maybe lean back somewhat to try to get my foot into my arm. Obviously, your proportions are really gonna affect how this feels, if this is possible, if it's comfortable or not. And then you notice how my chest is more turned towards you now instead of towards the front. When you're mermaid binding like this, that's going to have to happen. If you do that in dancer also, you're gonna be turned somewhat towards that back foot. And this is a lot, right? And I don't wanna forget what I'm doing down here. I wanna, keep my legs, whatever part of my legs are on the floor, pressing into the floor to keep my pelvis active, keep my pelvic floor active. And then to complete the mermaid bind, as it's called, your other arm would reach up, bend, and try to connect with that back one. Again, proportions matter. And for me, even though I can do it, because I have such a long torso, I would need to extend more in my spine. I would need to back bend more and lean back. And I can do it, but for myself personally, I feel a lot of compression in my lower back when I do that. So, again, you might have a strap around your foot, maybe with that loop, bending the leg, coming up. Let's say you wanted to practice the mermaid bind. You could reach back, see if it's possible to get that foot into your elbow somewhat. Or it might just be on your forearm. I could make this work too. It doesn't have to be snug in there. And then with my other arm, I could reach down for the strap, come up with it. And then I could walk my hand down the strap. And maybe my foot could be in there too. I'm just trying to show you, maybe it wouldn't get there, but you could still practice the mermaid bind idea. And I can close this loop between one hand and this hand without having to, at least for my proportions, like sink back to make it happen, to like crank into it, right? On the other side, so you have a different view, I would have to turn this way. Instead of reaching back for the pinky side of my foot, I would reach back for the big toe side of my foot, okay? And then I could try to bend my leg maybe a little bit more, see if I can slide that foot up higher, or maybe I can lean back just a little bit to help snug it in there, right? And that's as much as I can do comfortably without having to like really lean back and make this happen. And this would be one part of the bind. And then the other arm would rise up, okay? And then it would bend, and the hands would search for each other, or you would have the strap. If getting the strap on your foot first is too complicated, because I know it can be, you know, a process, you could be here, have the strap just all together in your front arm and let it hang back, and you can search for it with that back hand. Make that connection, and then I'm pulling up on the strap with this arm and back with this arm. And I'm lifting up through my heart. I'm lifting up towards the ceiling. Releasing, untwisting, coming down carefully. So that one is definitely different. It's like a back bend with some rotation in it. If your lower back is easily irritated, I wouldn't do the mermaid bind, because you can see that I had to turn, I had to rotate to do that. It's not like it's bad. You can totally back bend and twist at the same time. I could do it now. Like I'm leaning back and I'm twisting. It's a natural combination of movements that we do. But especially if you're trying to like figure this out, and maybe you have to lean back like I did if you're not going to use a strap, it just has more potential to maybe irritate your lower back. So the mermaid bind is another possible way to complete this loop of the arms to legs in King Pigeon. Arguably, the hardest way to bind is reaching back for the foot like I showed you in the introduction, and then lifting your elbow up. This is not, it doesn't seem like a hard movement, reaching back and then pointing my elbow up, but it's different when you've got resistance and you're holding your foot. So your arm is constantly being pulled back towards your foot, and you have less wiggle room from there to there. But it is possible, and we can start to work on that. So you would reach back like you're presenting a plate or something, and then reaching it behind you so your palm is up. And I'm making this like lobster claw with my hand, this L shape. So I would reach back, I'm retracting my shoulder, it's being squeezed in towards my spine, my shoulder blade is. And I'm gonna be, limited with that movement too. So this is as much as I can do. And then to make them meet, I'm gonna have to bend my leg more. And I'm actually having to rotate to make that connection, you see? Like if I stay completely parallel, I can't make this connection. Like I have to rotate just to get the bind. Period. For me, if you could retract your shoulder blade more, maybe you wouldn't have to turn like I do. But anyway, I reach back. I'm gonna have to rotate a little bit just to make this connection. Okay, and then I've got my foot. I've got it. And I've got the pinky toe edge. So from here, I would start the process of looking up, looking forward, and then I would start pointing my elbow out towards you, and I would notice and feel. And then my hand is gonna have to change position back there. As the shoulder comes up, obviously my fingers are gonna end up pointing down my foot. I'm gonna look forward. I'm gonna lean back, so I'm going into extension now. The extension that I have, it makes it easier for me. And then I would point the elbow towards you. My fingers are now starting to point down my foot. I'm even gonna walk this backhand back so I can lift up a little bit. And then when I can get into the full thing, I end up square again towards the front with my chest, and I'm really in strong extension in my spine. My shoulder is in full flexion. And I'm keeping my other hand down just for right now because it's helping me to lift up out of this somewhat and relieve some of the really strong stretch I'm feeling in my front hip. I'm really feeling a lot of stretch here. You could take both hands up and bind them together at the same time, but again, then you don't have anything on the floor to help push your weight out of your hips, right? So again, if you need blocks, then you would put them there beforehand. I'm just gonna switch sides to make everything even for me while I demo, reaching back. You might not have to, rotate as much as I did, and one side can be different than another. And if you're tighter in your pecs, you might have to turn more too to grab your foot. All right, so I've got it. I've got my foot, but I can tell by looking at my heart that it's definitely turned a little bit and it's not completely square. I'm just noticing that I had to do that. And then to make this a little bit easier for me because when I bend my arm, I'm making that distance shorter. Like between my upper body and my leg, when I bend the arm, I'm making that distance shorter. So since they're connected, I'm gonna have to lean back to make up for that space. And then I start the process of pointing my elbow out to the side. All right, I'm looking where I'm gonna be facing forward. And I would prefer just to set up that I have my other hand down here, pushing up. And then I point the elbow up, leaning back. My fingers are pointing down my foot. I'm not holding onto the side anymore when I'm actually in this. Okay? Of course, to release your bind, you could just let go and let the foot slowly come down, release your hand. You could do both hands at once, okay? So if you were able to get here, this is totally fine, right? And I'm getting a lot of opening in the front of my body. I'm also feeling some compression in my spine though. And I can get a little bit less if I come forward like this. It's really all about your proportions, you guys. Like you really have to feel what is going on in your body and what your joints are saying. You could, if this was comfortable and you felt safe here, then you could also reach up with this arm, this other one, which I just had down a second ago. I could reach up, bend it, and it could also try to search for the foot, and I could get them there together. And then I could simply think about lifting my heart up. Okay, and then you could release, take the arms down, come out of pigeon. So if that's really difficult, that idea of binding overhead like that, and you just cannot reach the foot, then again, the strap can be helpful. And this one, it is helpful to get the strap on your foot beforehand. And you would have kept the tail end of the strap up towards you, right? Not back there, because you would need to grab hold of it later. You could find the tail end of the strap here. And, with one arm, or both arms might be easier because you can kind of climb your way down. You can take hold of the strap, no matter where your foot is, right? It might be all the way back there. You could take hold of the strap, pull up on the strap, and it's gonna help to lift your heart up. And to be honest with you, even though I can do all those other binds, this actually feels a lot better for me. Like it actually feels physically better. Like I can get a lot of opening in my arms, in my triceps. I feel a stretch in that back hip, and I don't feel any compression in my spine. I might be able to walk down a little lower. You just have to explore. And right there, I start to feel compression in my spine. So my bones are telling me, hey, we're hitting each other, just so you know. We can't do any more down there. But I could add to this by, being able to bring my leg up closer, right? That makes it a little bit easier for me to maybe connect my hands to my foot. But I'm trying to tell you that it's not such of a big deal. Like, I actually think it feels better for me personally to use a strap. And I've closed the chain between my arms and my legs in the exact same way. I'm getting a full body stretch, full stretch for my front line. And then to release, straighten the arms, let go of the strap, let go of the leg. Coming down, coming out of pigeon. I like being able to workshop these things on the floor, like a little bit lower down, because when you come up into dancer, you can do all of these same binds, but you're gonna be standing and you're gonna be balancing at the same time. So these arm binds can be a little bit easier to workshop and for you to make decisions within when you're lower on the floor and you don't have to think about balancing at the same time. One thing to address in pigeon pose, which is your base, the angle of your leg, your front leg, really depends on how much external rotation you have comfortably in your hip. So keeping your foot closer towards your groin can be a more friendly place to be if you have less external rotation or you start to feel compression in your hip or something strange in your knee. I wouldn't push yourself to take the shin more perpendicular. What happens when you take your shin in pigeon, the front leg, right? What happens when you take your shin more perpendicular, like that? Do you notice what happens? My knee is, when it's here, it can be like more straight this way. When I take my shin more perpendicular, really what's happening is I'm externally rotating more. And you see how my knee points out to the side? If you cannot get your hip down to the floor comfortably and you take your arms up away to bind or something, there's just more stress and responsibility that you're placing on your outer knee here. Your knee, when it's straight, it can't turn. It's locked, okay? And your hip turns. However, when your knee is bent, your knee can actually rotate a little bit because the ligaments on the outside are relaxed. And so your knee is more vulnerable when your knee is bent. And that's why I prefer to keep my foot closer in towards the groin. This is just my opinion. If I want to explore my full external rotation, and I was going to do that in pigeon, I would personally keep my hands down. So I'm talking about the front leg, right? Like, you see here how my knee can point more forward? So it's almost more like pure flexion in my hip. Of course, I've got to externally rotate somewhat as I come down, but it's a lot easier for me to do here because I'm pretty much just like flexing and doing some external rotation in my leg. But when I angle my shin out forward more, I'm externally rotating to my maximum, all right? And I do feel it. When I'm here, I feel like a pinch right out here at this point. It's before my butt is on the floor. From the side, I'm here, I feel a pinch here, and I've got some space. My bones are telling me, hey, I'm done right here in this movement. We can't go any further. So I can't push my butt down to the floor. If I do that, my hips aren't going to be very happy, or my knee isn't going to be very happy. So I would rather, if I was going to explore my full external rotation here, I would rather have my hands down, just personally, because I can totally feel the compression here in my hip. And I don't want to come up and put more weight onto my hip and not have my hands here to help me. So when I do king pigeon, I prefer, just for me personally, to keep my front foot in closer towards my groin. Because when I bring my chest up and lift my arms away, it's just more pressure on my leg. And for me, it's no problem here because this is less external rotation than I have. And I've got enough flexion to be able to get my butt down here. And I can, reach my arms up and not feel compromised, and it's no problem. After pigeon pose, especially if you had to rotate or twist to create a bind, I would do some core work. I would do some core and serratus work just to really get everything hugged in back towards the center. Forearm plank would be nice. It can just be isometric like that, or plank plus. Now, dancer pose is going to be a little bit easier to talk about now because you can do the same binds in dancer that you can do in king pigeon pose. Before we get into dancer, sometimes I like to have people come into mountain pose, into standing, and simply do some heel raises, lifting up on their toes and then slowly lowering back down to start playing with that standing balance. And then those quadricep stretch ideas, like in lunge or in cobra, even child's pose, just things that can help lengthen the front of the legs. It's going to help free up your hip and extension when you go into dancer pose. Shifting balance, bending the back leg, trying to get my knee back there too to start that extension process. Reach back, grab the ankle. I could just keep my hand on my hip. I could do that. Pressing back, foot into the hand. Trying to control what's happening in my upper body so that I don't like tip or turn or anything like that, okay? And I could practice this, or I could start to lean forward, which might give me more room to extend the back leg more. I can really push my leg up strongly into my hand and come up and release. To me, that's one way to do Natarajasana, to do dancer's pose. It's just one way to do the arm bind. You could do that exact same thing and use this arm actually as an extension of your upper body, reaching forward long. You could start just by reaching up, pressing the leg back, working on your balance. And then you could start to lean forward, using your arm as a guide to help guide you towards the front, pushing that foot into the hand all the while in the back. I like to look in like little segments down towards the floor actually. And I'm opening one side, the front of the body at a time. The lower I go, the more I tip down, the more of a forward fold it becomes in the standing leg. So it becomes more of a hamstring stretch actually for my standing leg if I'm going to tip forward. If you wanted to use a strap, you could lasso your foot beforehand if you wanted to, centering your weight, bending the leg, reaching back wherever your hand needs to be on the strap. Other hand can be on your hip if you would like, or you can reach out. You could push that foot back. You could reach this arm forward. This could be one version of dancer. This could be one way dancer could look. If you wanted to challenge your balance more and challenge your standing leg, your hamstrings, then you could start to lean forward just a little tiny bit at a time, so you can make these tiny little corrections along the way, right? You could also push your foot back into your hand more to really stretch the hip flexors on that side. To stand up, you would push into your standing leg more, soften your grip, and release and come down. It's difficult to determine where these back bends begin, right? Like what the clear kramas are, because there's lots of different ways to do these. But you could say that maybe this could be krama 1, holding onto your foot, right? And then you decide to move on from there, wherever you're gonna go. Maybe this is krama 2, maybe this is dancer, maybe this is dancer, right? It just depends on what you wanna do. If you wanna lean forward more, if you wanna bind like this, if you wanna reach. Let's say you were gonna try the mermaid bind in dancer. So I'll take this leg first behind me, Space between my feet, bending the leg back there. So obviously I would have to reach back and be able to hold onto my foot. That would be the first step. I would have to be able to connect. That would be krama 1, stage 1. I would reach back instead of for the outside, for the inside, just like for pigeon. And then here I would need to bring my knee back as far as I could into extension. And it would make it a lot easier if I could really bend my leg a lot and just kind of scoot the foot up into the crook of my elbow. But since I found that I had to lean back in pigeon to get that, I'm probably gonna have to lean back a little bit here too. Do you see how I have to do that? To lean back, to connect my foot into my arm, and then I would bend it to kind of, to lock it in place. So from the front, whoop, when I personally take that half bind, my knee actually goes out to the side. I abduct it because it helps me to get my foot into my elbow more. In this version of pigeon, your upper body was actually rotated somewhat this way. So it's going to be the same thing here in the mermaid bind. And then once I have this half bind, I could take this other arm up, reaching. I'm balancing all the while. My bottom knee is soft. I would bend my elbow and the hands would search for each other. And I'm able to connect them together, and then I do connect them, the chain is all closed, and then I can really pull my heart forward towards this arm. Reaching up, bending, connecting, and then I can really push my foot into that back elbow and pull my heart forward and expand. And I'm thinking about pulling my hands up like a crown, up, towards the ceiling. Then I would release my hands, take this hand down, let the foot slide out of my elbow, and come down into standing. Let me show you the mermaid bind from the front view so you can really see what's happening, how the body is actually turning somewhat. And there's also a side bend happening, actually. I feel a lot of stretching in this side. Okay, so I've got the bind. I'm gonna pull my hands up, bring my attention forward. Also leaning forward a little bit, just exploring. Do you see how my heart is kind of facing that way? To release, I would stay focused, release my hands, this hand down, let the foot slide out, and turn back to the front. So I actually untwist and come back to the front. The overhead way of binding in Natarajasana, in dancer, is just like it was in king pigeon pose. But again, we would have to know beforehand if we need the strap to make our arms longer or to get past our quadricep or our psoas tightness before trying to do this. Of course, I would have already done a back bend class like the one that I made for you. I'd already be warmed up, and now I'm ready to workshop this. All right, so I would stand, I would have the strap tail actually in my hand, balancing and connecting with my standing leg, taking the other foot back, just a little tap. I would bend the leg, start the process of shortening the strap, keeping my gaze probably fixed ahead of me all the while so I could balance. You could pause here even with the strap over your shoulder, getting more of a passive stretch and just get your bearings here. Because sometimes you need to kind of like pause where you are and reset and balance once you've done a movement like that. And then you could take the one hand or both hands together, and you could always have more space, more strap available, okay? You could take the strap in your hands and the hands go overhead. And we practiced this or saw this in pigeon, right? This exact same thing. Now I'm just standing up. Pulling forward on the strap, it helps me to open my chest and my foot is pushing back. Obviously, to make this harder, I would walk my hands back. Walking my hands back makes my back extend more, so I get a deeper back bend. My shoulders are in full flexion. My back hip is in a lot of extension. And I could even make it more difficult and distribute the weight differently by leaning forward. pushing my foot up. Or if you had your hands on your foot, pushing your hands and your foot up. To release, mindfully rising up, let the hands slide down the strap or release the foot and then come down. Now that's one way to get into the overhead bind with the strap, and you don't have to do that maneuver of grabbing your foot and lifting your elbow up, which is of course another thing you can do. It's just more difficult, right? Because that's a more difficult maneuver and you're standing and balancing. But if you were gonna do exactly that, but not with a strap, you would have to do that. You would have to pause, standing, picking which leg is gonna go back, leg bends, externally rotate my shoulder and reach back. Take my knee open somewhat. This is just stuff my body has to do to make this connection. Grab my foot. Really try to squeeze my arm, get it as bent as I can, like make this angle really small. Because it's easier to get my elbow up if I can really squeeze this in tightly instead of it being all out here. Squeeze and shorten this distance. And then I think about pointing my elbow forward. I'm actually going to squeeze my core in here to support my back. My hand is on the top of my foot now. And I could, keep the other hand down. I could really do whatever with it. I'm really focusing on what's happening in my shoulder, pushing my foot into my hand. And it's more comfortable for me in this version to lean forward. It takes compression out of my lumbar spine. You could take the other arm up, bend it, and let it search for the other hand and let it kind of wrap around. And then I kind of evenly distribute my foot between both hands, and then I can lean forward even more. Paralleling, squaring my chest. To come up, pushing into my bottom foot, releasing the hands, coming back down, and then just giving the body a moment to process and digest what that felt like. So you can see in Dancer, you can make it more challenging by practicing different kinds of binds. And different versions, different binds are going to be easier or more difficult depending on your proportions and your flexibility. So I was trying to describe to you what I was feeling so that it would make sense, all the movements that I was doing and all the little adjustments that were happening. And now I know what sensations mean. When I was in that full bind and my foot was back here and I was connected to my foot and it's pulling me back the whole time, I could feel the compression of my scapula into my back. I could literally feel like a pinching back here because I couldn't go backwards anymore, right? And my foot was continuing to pull back and my shoulder blade was like, oh, we can't go back any further. And so when you're in these advanced poses, that's really important information because you can know when you're in the pose that you can't get any more movement from that joint. So if I'm in Dancer and I feel that compression in my shoulders, I know I can't go deeper with my shoulders. Does that make sense? I'm gonna have to get more movement or more freedom, if it's available, from my spine or from my hip, right? If I'm bound to my foot and I just can't go anymore, I'm gonna have to lean back with my spine. That's not my shoulders, this is my back, right? I'm gonna have to go further by doing that. Let's say I can't do that either. Let's say I'm at full compression in my spine. I can't do anything else. In order to go deeper into the back bend, or if I wanted to get lower to the floor, I would have to hinge forward. I would have to bend at my hips. So your poses are expressions of your joints and the movement you have available in your joints, the opening that is available. And yeah, just make sure that you take care of your body in these and you don't sacrifice your body's good and your body's comfort to try to look a certain way. If you're just starting to play with Dancer or you wanna see what your comfortable limit is in that pose, then I would start with just the reaching back with the arm like this for the foot. Try that on both sides and then see how your spine feels, see how your shoulders feel. or I guess feel how your shoulders feel how your spine feels, and then, you know, what leaning forward or back does, and take all of that information in a simpler version of the pose, and then you can graduate that into other versions if you want to go there. Urdhva Dhanurasana is wheel pose. Wheel pose is going to be your maximum spinal extension, your maximum back bend, but instead of pressing yourself up into it as we do in Cobra and upward facing dog, we push ourselves up into it facing up. So you get to explore your maximum extension in a different way with different muscle groups working. In Urdhva Dhanurasana, we have not only that full spinal extension, but we have hip extension, which is limited by your quadricep and your psoas flexibility. So again, before you play with wheel, it's going to feel more free if you have stretched your psoas and your quadriceps beforehand in the ways that I've suggested. And not only that, but we have full shoulder flexion again. What your wheel is going to look like is going to depend on what does your maximum shoulder flexion look like, what does your maximum back bend look like, what is your maximal hip extension, all added together. And also we have wrist extension too, right? You've got your hands back there and you're pressing up, and so we're asked for wrist extension as well. I like to actually get into wheel from bridge. So often what I will do in classes and in my own practice is I will start down here and I'll make sure that everything is set up right, neutral spine, and I'll practice. I'll practice initiating the back bend with my glutes and with my hips, which is what's happening here. In this version of this back bend, your hips are going to be the highest point. Once I've practiced bridge, maybe twice, for 5 or so breaths, I would start to work into the kramas of wheel from this. You could even just stay here with your butt down and start to practice the arm situation. So in wheel, your arms are going to be back like this, right? You could, from this position, bend your arms, extend your wrists, take them back like this, and then literally just pick up your arms and try to get your hands down onto the floor back there. And you might have to scoot them in a little bit closer and bend your arms in tighter. But you can practice getting your hands down flat here and see if you have that wrist extension available, right? You can make it a little bit easier on your wrists by taking the hands really close towards your shoulders, right? If you take them further back, that's a lot more extension. You can touch your shoulders with the fingertips and just see what this feels like, literally just doing this. So to actually get into wheel pose, I would start personally from bridge. I would breathe in and press the hips up. Then I would do that exact shoulder thing. I actually think I should take this off because I think it's going to cover the microphone. So just 1 second. This is a pretty non-scary place to be and a good way to just set up for the shape of wheel. So this could be like Krama 1, let's say. You've got your hips up in extension, you've got your arms back in this setup position. And then what has to happen is we've got to use our arms. We actually have to press down into the floor with the shoulders, with the hands, enough so that we can lift the shoulders and the head off the floor, right? So you could just practice that. You could be here, and then exhale, push with the hands, let your shoulders and your head take flight, and you could touch down again. And as you press up, you could start to play with letting your head tip back a little bit and look behind you. Instead of looking up, you could look backward somewhat, because in wheel, your head is going to be facing that way, right? So this is a lot of arm strength, pushing down into the arms. It's going to be actually harder here than in full wheel because you can, distribute some of the weight differently. But I'm letting my gaze go back. To come down, you tuck your chin, your shoulders come down, and then you can take a break on your hips. And take little breaks as you need. Relax your wrists, you could do wrist rolls. And then the next step would be, once you're there and you know you can lift your shoulders up, once you've taken flight, you push into your arms more and you explore how high you can come up, at least in your upper body. So you push more into your arms. Right, so from here, I've got the mat, I'm looking back, I'm gonna push more. I'm gonna push into my arms a lot, okay? If I feel like I need to make any adjustments, I just like take little tiny movements with my hands and I look at them, make sure they're comfortable. And this is my maximum shoulder flexion. Everyone will be different. You might be further than me. You know, you might be able to get your chest, you know, more forward and your arms more vertical. You might have less. You might only be able to come up this much because you don't have this much more shoulder flexion. But you just press up, explore. When you're ready to come down, tuck your chin, bend your arms, everything touches down, take a little break. And these are things you might explore over a period of time, several practices, maybe a couple months. I'm not saying this might all happen in one go. These are just the steps you would move through to progress into your wheel pose. After you've explored straightening your arms, which is gonna let you explore how high you can come up comfortably in your upper body, then you have to feel with your mind what's happening in your back. Are you feeling compression in your back? If you are, it might be mild enough that it's fine. If it's a lot of compression, you might actually walk your feet away from your face and make your back bend more wide and more gradual. If you don't feel anything, then you might be able to extend your hips more and actually press your hips up higher. Krama 1, Krama 2, pushing up with the arms, Krama 3, and this might be what it is. This might be your wheel. If you feel compression again, you could walk your feet further away so your back bend can be more gradual, right? It takes some of the pressure out of your lower back. If you don't feel anything here in your back, you might be able to push your hips up more, which is more extension. Push your hips up more. You might be able to extend your legs to do that as well. It accomplishes the same thing. You can see that, you know, I wasn't quite at my full shoulder flexion either because it's pushing me further, but this is as much shoulder flexion as I have, and this is as much back extension as I have. So I'm feeling compression in various places, but someone might come up and be here and feel compression in their shoulders, right? Someone might feel compression in their back and their shoulders, and that might be what it is. It might be very tiring for them to hold a wheel, actually. You might have to walk your feet away from you to get that compression out of your spine. If you walked your feet away to come down, walk them back in. Tuck your head, come down. Get the weight off of your hands. If you're someone who didn't feel any compression in your back when you came up or when you pushed your hips up higher, then you might, if you wanted to really explore your full extension, your back extension and wheel, you could walk your feet closer to your face. Doesn't make sense to do that if you feel compression in your back because the compression is just going to get stronger. The pinch is just going to get stronger. But if you don't feel that, you might explore walking your feet up closer just to see. So, again, if you didn't feel anything in your back, you might walk your feet in. And you stop when you feel compression in here. That's what I'm talking about, in here. So I feel it there. So I might be able to walk my feet up a little closer, but I don't know what that would really give me because I feel compression in here. I'm not sure that would really feel good for me. When I'm ready to come down, I would walk my feet back to where they came from and lower down. couple things sometimes happen in wheel pose, in the legs and in the arms. Sometimes when the hips go up and people straighten their legs, the knees actually start to splay apart somewhat. Instead of being perfectly parallel, the knees will actually start to open. And one of the reasons that happens is because your glutes are working in this pose, and your glutes externally rotate your hips too. That's one of the things that they do. So it's not necessarily wrong, but one thing that can happen if your knees start to open like that, the muscles of the pelvic floor become shortened, and you might actually get some pinching sensations in your SI and in your lower back that might not feel very good. If that's an issue, you could take a strap around your upper thighs and limit the degree to which your knees can go open like that. So taking this same strap that I put that little loop in earlier, I might take this loop around my upper thighs so that they're, hips width distance apart. And then when I come up into wheel, my legs would be stopped by the strap, so they wouldn't be able to open any more than that. You could also do the same thing to your shoulders. Sometimes the elbows, instead of staying like this when you're up there, they splay out. In other anatomy workshops I've talked about things like that, and probably why that's happening when you press up and your elbows go out is because the body is running into itself and it's trying to find more space, right? When you press up into wheel, you're going into your full shoulder flexion. When you're done, you can't go back anymore, right? So your body might try to swing around the point of bony contact and find a little bit of extra space for your shoulders. So that's not necessarily wrong either. It just indicates to you that there's some kind of restriction or limit, and it's probably compression. The same thing can happen in downward facing dog. If someone's at full flexion and they can't get 180 degrees, the elbows might bend outwards to try to get around that point. If you did want to limit that and explore whether it really was compression, or maybe there's a lot of tension in the front of your shoulders and your pecs that's doing that, you could take that same loop and put it over your arms instead, over your upper arms. Keeping them, shoulder width distance, or maybe a little bit more, just to give yourself a little bit more wiggle room. It would be a little uncomfortable when you sit up because there'd be a strap in your face, but if you wanted to limit the degree to which your elbows bow open, you can try that. And then when you came up here, you would, your arms would be pushed into the strap somewhat. And you would know it was compression because you'd feel it in the back of your shoulder. If it was tension stopping you or tension causing the elbows to bow out, you would feel the restriction here in the front. One little trick, a way to use props, especially if you have limited shoulder flexion, or even if you want to make this feel more easeful and you do have 180 degrees of shoulder flexion, you could do wheel at a wall using 2 blocks. And you'd put your hands on the blocks, sturdy blocks. I would use cork ones, and the blocks can help make up for some flexion, a degree of flexion that you might not have. You would put the blocks on their lowest height on your mat against the wall where your hands would be. So they're not close together, there's some space in between them, and you might need to correct this a little bit. And then you would, when taking your hands back, you would put your hands on the blocks like this, with the fingers draping over the edge. And I feel like I need to take them a little bit closer in because I want my hands to be in the center of the blocks so they're stable. So what's the difference between this and this? This and this. What's happening in my shoulder? Less flexion, more flexion. Might not make a huge difference here with your arms bent, but when you press up,
with the arms straight, then the blocks can give you this much more flexion than you actually have in your shoulders. It gives you that much of a head start. Like my hands are already on the floor, only having flexed this much.
Hi you guys, I am in the editing phase of this, and this last little segment about wheel using the blocks doesn't have any audio because I moved a certain way and I accidentally unhooked the lav mic. But I'm just showing you in this clip how to actually get up into wheel using those two blocks. So you would start exactly as we did before in that bridge setup, and then placing your hands back on the blocks, which are against the wall, bridging your hips up, placing the palms of your hands on the blocks, and then as you press up, you are literally just pushing the blocks into the wall more and into the floor more. If you have a lot of shoulder opening, this may not make a lot of difference for you, but if you are limited in your shoulders, then this could make all the difference for you. And within a range, you can play with how close together or how far apart the blocks are. And I'm just showing you there, again, the difference with the block and without the block. I'm going to offer you another pose that you can get into from wheel pose that allows you to really isolate your shoulder flexion and really get a strong stretch, like specifically right here in the front of your body, opening up like right in here. Because in wheel, there's a lot of stretching happening here for sure, but your hips are going to be the highest point. There's a lot of stretching happening in the hips. In this pose, in forearm wheel, which is called Viparita Dandasana, it really focuses the stretch here, and it is like major extension for your upper back. And sometimes what can happen, since the lumbar spine extends more and it's very mobile in these directions, it can kind of steal some of the back bend from your thoracic spine and your upper spine. And Viparita Dandasana really targets and isolates the extension into your upper back. If you don't like this pose and it's too difficult for the shoulders, you can also get pretty isolated thoracic extension in Sphinx pose and in puppy pose. The kramas would be very similar to wheel to a certain point, but then we would have to come down and find a way to be on our forearms. I would have practiced wheel before I tried this. Hi you guys, I hope you don't mind me voiceovering this part. If I don't look at the lav mic battery and I don't see that red light, I don't know that it's turned off, but I will voice over what I'm going through here in forearm wheel, going through the kramas, which are very similar to the kramas of wheel. So there's the first krama, getting the hands back in bridge, and then you really just have to get there to krama 2. You don't press up all the way to get into forearm wheel, although you can. You actually stop on the top of your head, and then one hand at a time reaches back. It's going to crawl back so that you can get your elbow on the floor, and that really depends on your shoulder flexion. And I ground that elbow. I still have my weight on my head, and then the other hand walks back too. It kind of crawls back. I get my elbows down, and then I can press into my forearms and see if I can lift my head off of the floor. And that's going to be dictated by the length of your forearm and how much shoulder elevation you have. And you're already using your shoulder elevation in the pose. Since this is really about the shoulders, you don't have to walk the feet back. You don't have to walk them forward, although you can. You just have to notice what you're feeling. So I'm showing there that you could walk the feet away from your head to, again, make the back bend more gradual, to get out of any compression sensation in the lower spine. And to come out, you would drop down to the top of your head again. Make sure your neck isn't craned back. One at a time, get the palms flat again so that you can be in krama 2 of wheel, tuck your chin, and lower back down onto your shoulders. I'm going to do that pose one more time, but with my head facing you so you can better see what I do with my hands, with my arms to get them situated. This is an intense posture, and you got to keep your mind cool. You've got to keep your breath and your mind focused so you don't freak out, because these are very novel feeling movements. You just got to take it one step at a time. Hips come up, hands go down, trying to get my hair out of the way. All right, and then I would press down, get my head down, and then I'm actually gonna get my head onto the floor. And this is where I am. And then I would choose a hand with my head still down and walk my hand back into, my shoulder goes into flexion, and now that one's down, my elbow's down. The other hand walks back, I get the elbow down. They might not be perfect, but I can always fix them in a second. I take a second. I might be able to press up a lot or a little bit. It depends on the height of your forearms. And I can kind of slide my elbows in a little closer, pushing down. Really isolating the movement in my upper back. I can do whatever I want with my legs. I can keep them where they were. I can straighten them out. And then to come down, I make sure my head isn't tilted back. I get down on the top of my head. One hand is on the floor, then the other hand, and then I'm where I started. I can tuck my head and come down. So as you can probably see, these two back bends, wheel and forearm wheel, have pretty different feelings in the upper body than dancer and pigeon did. In king pigeon and dancer, the legs were grounded on the floor and the chest was opening, the shoulders were going backwards into extension, so there's this really open, free feeling in the chest. And then in wheel and forearm wheel, the upper body is what's locked on the floor. The shoulders are in flexion, which is the complete opposite of extension. And so we might end up in our full back extension, but we got there in a different way and we challenge joints differently. Wheel and forearm wheel can feel a little bit more restrictive because your upper body is locked on the floor. You can't see what's going on in your feet and your legs and your hips. You really have to just use your mind's eye. Backbends are stimulating to the nervous system, and that stimulation can feel like increased energy, it can feel good, but it could also be interpreted as stress and as something that's scary and fearful. It's completely normal when you start workshopping deep backbends like this that you're gonna feel this increase in energy. And as you keep practicing and as you get used to certain movements, your nervous system is gonna start to respond differently and you're gonna interpret these inner signals differently. Being in something like forearm wheel where your arms are locked on the floor and your vision feels kind of restricted, it can make you feel, even though you know where you're going and what you're doing, it can make you feel kind of stuck, which can make you feel perhaps somewhat fearful, or there can be anxiety. And you just notice those inner responses when you're in the pose, but you've got to keep your awareness centered. That's what makes these poses really advanced, because they can elicit these feelings, and if you let them run away with you, then you're not going to be as safe in the pose anymore. Same thing in inversions like a handstand. Like if you let your emotions and these reactions really run away with your mind, you're not going to be present with your body and be able to, safely and mindfully come out through these stages. After you've done a few attempts, come down onto your back, give your heart a chance to slow down, because you're stretching your heart, it'll speed up a little bit. Give your heart and your breath and your nervous system a chance to relax. Give your mind a chance to observe your calm reaction to all of that. And then in terms of counter poses, I don't believe in doing really strong movements after really strong movements, even if they're the opposite movement. And I think I've said that before in this course. So instead of coming out of wheel and doing a forward fold, I would just rest for a second. It depends on where you're coming from, right? Like if you're in dancer, you're standing. If you were in wheel, you're gonna end up on your back. But just find a neutral place to be, where your spine is more neutral. and then gradually come into forward folds. Maybe keep your joints softer, keep your knees bent, and then slowly let your spine come into a rounded position. So that concludes our back bend section. The principles that you used for these back bends, you can use to workshop and learn and explore your body in any other back bends that you encounter and that you want to workshop or break down for yourself.